Welcome back to It Is What It Is. I'm Corbin.
And I'm Anthony. And today we have some delicious meat for you all. We're talking about what makes good teams good and bad teams bad. And maybe some bad teams are good, but they're terrible. And good teams are bad, but they're also good. I don't know. It's all topsy-turvy here.
Yeah, excellent. So we had talked about the individuals, what makes a great NBA players, their decision making, and that you can have all the talent and skill in the world, but that kind of puts people a league apart from others. So then you asked the question, what makes a team good? And that's a complicated question. So we wanted to look at organizations and teams kind of as social units and see if we can draw upon any resources to evaluate how good of a social unit a team is. And so I thought a great place to bring a good idea to bring in is the Chinese principles of harmony from ancient Chinese philosophy.
I'm
So
excited for the I'm excited for the Eastern cultural understanding.
yeah, me too. Get us out of Aristotle for a day.
Yeah. What a jerk.
So just as some context, I'm not going to go into a whole big background, but just for some context, the early Chinese debates about society were centered around a couple of key questions. And one of them was, how do we achieve harmony with the universe, with ourselves, and with our society? And are humans intrinsically good or bad or neither? And trying to answer and resolve those questions and build societies based upon the answers to those questions led to some very interesting schools of thought. And so, even though some of these are separated by generations, there's enough of an overlap that there was a healthy debate in China about which direction to go. And I kind of want to see if we can play out these Chinese principles with NBA teams and see if we can revitalize that debate. So, all right. So, the first one I wanted to talk about was Taoism. And Taoism's guiding principle of how to achieve harmony is to find and strike the balance in nature. So with the principles of yin and yang, there's kind of opposing principles in nature that can antagonize one another, but also provide balance. So if you get one principle really strong and the other one really weak, everything's going to be out of whack, and that causes chaos. But if you can strike a good harmony between these two opposing principles, then you can achieve a balance and a harmony that resonates at every layer. So that resonates at the ecological level, at the individual level, and at the social level. So the driving principle there is nature, do what's natural. Being natural is to let things kind of take their natural course and not try to resist the natural course of things. So with that kind of explanation of a general principle, we'd like to see if we can identify teams that maybe reflect the use of this principle, one team that does it well, and one team that has bad consequences when they try to do it.
The Phil Jackson Bulls come to mind. I correct me if I'm wrong, but it wasn't until his Laker years that he became known as the Zen Master. Is that true?
I feel like that might have been a popular conception once he was at the Lakers, but it was in part because he had implemented some of the same things in Chicago.
Yeah. But the reason why I bring up the Phil Jackson Bulls, and I guess to a lesser extent the Lakers, was because I remember in The Last Dance there was this story that Dennis Rodman and Phil Jackson told, where like in the middle of their, I think it was their '98 season or '99 season, uh, Dennis just couldn't. He just didn't want to play anymore. He like lost all motivation, and he really just needed a break from the game. And he was a big gambler, and he's like, I just need to go to Vegas to like, de-stress and party for a few days. And Phil Jackson basically just let him go. And a lot of the guys on the team were kind of upset about that. I think Jordan being number one, but Phil said, "Hey, listen, we got to trust Dennis to, be himself and trust that he's also going to come back. I'll give him the 3 days off, but he has to come back." And they kind of, like you said, let the team just be who they are. And of course, Dennis came back and he felt refreshed. And I think he went on a little tear after that. And so that was kind of the embodiment of how the Bulls played. And then also Phil Jackson's other teams. He's quite famous for being known for like understanding what all the tendencies and personalities of his team players are, as so that they can kind of like he optimizes their strengths and lets them be who they want to be without interfering with that too much, so that they can all operate together in harmony.
That's a really good example. And for a less successful example, I want to bring up a story that Jimmy Butler shared a few weeks ago. He was talking in response to questions about his time in Minnesota and Philly before going to Miami, which were both kind of rocky situations. He came under a lot of scrutiny and criticism. And so they asked him what went wrong in Philly. They seemed to have this stacked team and couldn't win. And he shared, I walked in and I knew that I had this reputation of being kind of a jerk and bossy. And so I didn't want to be that. I wanted to give them a chance to bring me into their culture. And we sat down to watch film, and Brett Brown's there, and Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid. And so we got all the superstars in a room watching tape with Coach, and nobody's saying anything. We're all just watching the tape, and I'm looking around like waiting for some kind of instruction or guidance or tips. Nothing. And then they walk out of the tape session, and he's like, "What was that? What did we just waste our time doing?" And the impression I got was that from that story, kind of by implication, is that Brett Brown, as a coach, brought in these superstars that are going to be the key points of the offense and defense, and kind of let them draw the conclusions that they could from the tape that they could then act upon in the ways that they wanted to. So it kind of felt like a hands-off approach. Let the star players be stars, and they can work it out among themselves. And so there's that, let players be who they are and who they want to be. But we know that didn't turn out well at all. There just never seemed to be strong chemistry with the Sixers, and broke up within less than a year. So the next school of thought that I want to talk about is legalism, and it's pretty straightforward from the name. Here, the idea is that, and one of the guiding ideas is that humans are intrinsically bad. They're selfish. They're not going to cooperate very well, and so what you need are really clear, strict rules with strong enforced punishments. So the goal is to get people to act against their bad nature to contribute beneficially to society. And here the idea is that we need a ruler who's wise and shrewd and knows how to get people to do what they're supposed to do, and uses whatever means necessary to make that happen. And so their legalism is kind of driven by law and punishment.
Oh, I got a great example for you. So
okay.
I'm reminded of the Pat Riley Heat. I mean, this is prevalent throughout his whole tenure as the president of the team. Most famous example I can think of is when Antoine Walker was on the team. This was like their championship season or the year after that. He had come into camp overweight. And in the NBA, you're not terribly overweight, but the Heat is famous for having like a body fat requirement. And they also have, I think they need to hit like certain cardio benchmarks. And so Antoine Walker came into camp over his body fat allotment, and he was suspended for like the first few weeks of the season until he could get under the requirement, and then they would let him play. And so that was like a very team enforced rule system that no other team in the NBA has. And I think Eric Spoelstra still keeps that philosophy because he understands how much how much your body plays into it, and they really want to try and maintain physical peak health. But I think it happened again like 2 or 3 years ago. I can't remember who did it, but I know it popped up again recently. Maybe it was Dion Waiters when he was on the team.
I was going to say it was Waiters. Yeah.
It was probably Waiters. He's a chubster.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, the Heat might have had some success. LeBron said he learned a lot about winning by going there. And I wonder how much of that was not just learning how to win with other players and with veteran experience, but also organizationally, what's necessary to get a team on track and keep them disciplined. I think a maybe more notorious example of this and less successful was the Boylen Bulls, Jim Boylen in Chicago, who lost his job just a little bit ago. but for a couple of years was just known for being really hard on his players. Had very strict expectations for their practice regimen, for their game performance, and if they didn't perform well, would call extra practices and have them do suicides and things that typically at the professional level is considered beneath these pro players. So he was really treating them more like a youth league or high school or college team with strong disciplinary measures, and that didn't turn out too well. There's a couple player revolt meetings where they basically voted no confidence and tried to let the organization know they weren't happy, and now he's out. So yeah, that's a lot. And here's the early version of hippies. But the idea, why do we keep antagonizing wars with others by trying to take their resources? Instead, let's have a really good society, and instead of compete with us, maybe they'll want to join us, so we can conquer love by bringing into the fold more people and territories. But it wasn't just the peace, love, and happiness. Motsu was very helpful to recognize that there are going to be obstacles. There are going to be people who decide to try and take advantage of charity and a mild manner. He said, be loving, be kind, but build your walls. Make sure that your city has good defenses and prepare for battle. So it's a very pragmatic approach. Let's be kind to one another. Let's enjoy what we're doing and play music and have a good, thriving society. But be ready in case somebody tries to invade you. Be defensive. So with that kind of combination between universal and defensivism, do you have an example of a team that?
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind is the Durant, Curry, Clay, Green Warriors, and it probably goes back before Durant even joined the team. They always seem to once Kerr became the coach, and this is like definitely post Kerr because Mark Jackson was a very rigid kind of person, but once Kerr became the coach, the players started to, at least in news outlets, they would say how much more fun they were having and that basketball was fun again. And they certainly played that way. I mean, Curry took off as one of the two best players in the NBA, and essentially how they recruited Durant to join the Emmy. But he was in friendship with those guys, having played with them in the Olympics, and they basically was like, "Hey, it's really fun over here. Come join us." And he even openly talked about how much fun he had after joining the Warriors. Who knows what happened in that last year?
That's good. I think really struggling. I think we have something that works. That's the Lob City Clippers. So theirs was a lot of fun to watch, and it looked like they were playing together a bit. So I'm talking about early DeAndre Griffin and Chris Paul, and Lob City referring to the number of alley oops that those guys would get. It was a lot of fun seeing both Jordan and Griffin dunk on people and just get the crowd energized. But they never seemed to be able to get much success out of the regular season. I think they only went to the second round once and really couldn't seem to get into the mode for playoff basketball. There's injury reasons for that too, so maybe this is an unfair example. But when Doc Rivers kind of took over the helm, one thing he emphasized was we can't play like a video game. Like it's a lot of fun to do alley-oops and dunk and run the fast break, but we need to focus on winning and beating the other team. And so kind of recognizing that just having a good time and enjoying yourself is not going to be effective for that organization. So the fourth school of thought, and maybe the one most well known to a lot of our audience or to some of our audience, would be Confucianism. And it's hard to characterize this in an easy single principle. So I'm just going to call it a sense of belonging or vision. But the idea is that what we need is not one attitude or one perspective, but rather that each individual in society knows what their roles are and plays those roles appropriately. So children, respect your parents. Employees, follow the rules and do your work and do what your employers ask of you. But employers, treat your employees with kindness and provide them the energy and resources so that they can be productive. So it's kind of a lot of different principles depending on what role you're playing at any particular time. And one person can play multiple roles, right? I can be a son, a father, a friend, a rival. I can have civic leadership, and all of these roles ask different things of me. But if I know how I belong, how I fit into society, and I know what those expectations are for those various roles, then I can participate to my fullest capacity without rocking the boat. So with that kind of sense of all the pieces moving together in their appropriate ways and everybody knowing what their role is. Do you have any examples for a team that exemplified that?
Well, if you don't mind, um, we've been playing good cop, bad cop, and I would like to take the role of the bad cop in this one because I have a really good bad example.
Yeah, I thought you might. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about this. Yeah, I think an obvious one that comes to mind is the Spurs. Popovich has had this reputation, and first time in 22 years that the Spurs are not in the playoffs. And basically, since Pop started, I think this is his first or second time ever to not be in the playoffs. And that, of course, coincided with Duncan's rise to the NBA and being one of the best power forwards of all time. But he was able to bring the best out of players. We know that Kawhi Leonard now is in the top 3 to 5 players in the NBA, and he was not expected to be that high of a draft pick, but within his first 2 years was already Finals MVP and making a huge impact on the Spurs. We know that he got Manu Ginobili, who was an Olympian champion in Argentina, to play as a bench player and to basically take the sixth man role and help lead the second squad. And he thrived. Probably going to be a Hall of Famer. Tony Parker, a small, undersized guard, was able to utilize his skills and become a Hall of Famer. Likely, all these players were pretty much expecting to make the ballots. But it wasn't just the stars. We had people like Jonathan Simmons, who right? Jonathan Simmons came out of nowhere and was putting up 20 points a game in a role where he could play some strong defense, get a lot of transition baskets. Pop knew how to utilize his strengths and put him into the positions where he would succeed. Patty Mills, a backup point guard who has thrived in that position and helped have some explosive offensive games. It seems like he knows how to make random role players suddenly turn into starter quality or even better players.
And I think to your point of culture, like Pop definitely sets the tone, but you can't have a culture without the whole team. And there's a lot of big stories of Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Tony Parker setting the stage like we're not above the level of work that's required of the role players and the rookies, so we're gonna do it too, and that way everybody buys into the system. And they're kind of top to bottom, from the president of the organization to the last assistant coach on the team to the last player on the bench, that everybody buys into the system, so they all understand the importance of their roles, and it allows them to kind of like not only maximize their effectiveness, but play better than the sum of their parts in all facets of it.
Yeah. Now, time for you to be the bad cop.
Yeah, which is a perfect segue into this really bad team, my favorite team, unfortunately. And the example that I'm going to go with is the Phil Jackson-led Knicks, which I guess in a third layer is a full circle because he was the first person that we mentioned.
Yeah. It's great that he makes the list twice. Once is a good example, once is a bad example.
Right. And the reason why I picked the Phil Jackson Knicks, I mean, it's still prevalent in the organization, but when Phil Jackson came on board, he was insistent on instilling a culture in the organization. And everything that came out in the news that year was all about developing culture. And you would hear it from the players, you'd hear it from coaches, you'd hear it from the front office, but nothing ever gelled. And it was kind of obvious right out of the gate that this kind of goes back to the Taoism perspective too. It was like, even if you instill this culture, the players still have to buy in to some extent. And so he is famous for the triangle offense, and he tried to instill the triangle offense philosophy into the organization. And on paper, that was like, yeah, this team needs an identity. And the players were a bit apprehensive about that. And I think that initial problem right there is what led to the downfall, because Melo would outwardly say, hey, I want to buy into the system, but then he would do things on the court that were contrary to that. And that led to coaching rotations that didn't quite fit in the philosophy. It led to trades that didn't quite fit in the philosophy. It led to draft choices that were short-sighted because you're drafting players not for talent or skill, but because of whether they would fit into the system or not. And all of that led to this disaster of, the Knicks winning 17, 22, and then 17 games again. And then they picked Derek Fisher as a head coach who only knew the triangle, and he would only let him coach the triangle, fired him after a year. Then they hired Jeff Hornacek, who demonstrated that he could coach a winning system in Phoenix, forced him into the triangle, and of course they didn't win very much, fired him. And then ultimately Phil Jackson hired Kurt Rambis, who was like his triangle disciple with the Lakers, who couldn't coach in Minnesota, and all the Knicks fans were terrorized at this idea. And again, he couldn't coach the Knicks into success, and he still had Jeff Hornacek was a bit more freewheeling, but Kurt Rambis was very rigid in his structure. Rotations didn't make sense. Players were not happy, and so you get this Confucianism gone bad scenario. That might make a good movie too.
And at least at the end of all that, they were able to pick up Kevin Durant in free agency. So too soon. Yeah. So the question that seems natural to come out of this, we've got all these debating schools of thought, and we've given some examples of both. But so, which principle is the one that gets you the most success? What's the best principle for organizing your team culture? And I hope that we've kind of demonstrated that any one of these principles, or maybe combination of principles, can work for a team, but you have to find the principles that work for the pieces that you have. You can't force a culture or a set of principles on individuals who are not willing to go with that culture. So it's a matter of fit, I think, between the principles and the players, the persona.
For all of the GMs out there who are listening to us trying to understand which culture and philosophy to ingrain into your organization, there is no right answer. You have to basically analyze your system and determine which piece makes the best fit, and maybe parts of these work in tangent with each other, in conjunction with each other. And if you don't like that answer, well, it is what it is.